Hello, I'm Charlotte Leisman. Welcome back to the Gothic Literary Society. Today we are talking about a book review, and that book is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So there will be plot spoilers ahead, so if you haven't read this and you'd like to go read it, feel free to stop this movie and come back and join us later. So to get us started, let me give you a quick synopsis of the story here. So the book opens and there are three individuals living a very isolated life in a home in New England. So the main character is Mary Catherine Blackwood. She goes by the name Mary Cat, which fits her very well if you've read this. And her sister Connie, who is agoraphobic, and their uncle Julian, who is dying, unfortunately, throughout the book. 6 years prior to the story opening, the entire rest of their family died of poisoning. And the initial suspect, of course, had been Connie, because she is the one who does all the cooking for the family, and the poison was in their dinner that night. She was acquitted when the trial occurred, so she was found innocent, but the entire village still assumes that the two girls had something to do with the killing of the family, and they use that rationale as a reason to persecute them. Mary Catherine is our protagonist, Mary Cat, and she is a perfect example of an unreliable narrator. And we're going to cover more about what makes her unreliable and what that looks like in other examples in another video. But I'll give you a brief intro. At the very, very beginning of the book, in the first paragraph, she says that she likes her sister Constance and Richard Plantagenet and Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom. So she makes a number of other comments as well. The beauty about Shirley Jackson is Shirley Jackson writes really incredible plot level stories, and yet her writing is almost entirely focused on the B story. So I wrote an article a while back, and it's on my author website, charlotteleisman.com, and I talked about how Gothic writing makes the B plot tangible. And Shirley Jackson is a really good example of that. So she is just a master of subtext. If you're looking to learn more about subtext, and we're going to talk a little bit about it here today, you want to study her writing. So if you know much about Shakespeare, Shakespeare presented Richard Plantagenet as having killed several of his family members. And historians differ about whether that's actually accurate. However, we have to assume that Mary Catherine is acquiring her understanding of Richard Plantagenet from Shakespeare, most likely, particularly in light of the comment she makes about the Amanita phalloides death cap mushroom. That's a poisonous mushroom. So she basically says in one sentence, I like my sister Constance, I like this guy Richard Plantagenet, who purportedly killed a number of his family members, and I love this mushroom that is poisonous. So that's your intro to Mary Catherine. She's a very, very unique character. Her voice is consistently fanciful and yet always off, like just enough that it keeps you constantly on edge. And that makes her just fascinating. So, antagonists. There are two distinct antagonists in this book. The first is the village. There is actually a greater village and a lesser village. We'll get into that in a minute. But the village is definitely an antagonistic force. It's acting against Mary Catherine and Constance in several different ways. So, first of all, there's the open taunting and mocking and ridiculing of them. Secondly, there is actually a violent act against the girls and their home later in the book. But then also, if you consider Constance, who's agoraphobic, there are people in the village who are actively trying to draw Constance back out into society. And that sounds like a nice thing. That sounds like they mean well. And I think the characters who are doing this may mean well, but I think Jackson presents it as a violent and hostile force in that she sets up this book in such a way that the village can never be good. Not in light of the individual, and we'll get into that in a second when we talk about the theme. So what she's trying to say is that those who are attempting to draw Constance back out into the greater village are not friendly forces in her life. There's a second antagonist in the book. He enters around the 1/3 point. That is their cousin Charles. Charles parallels the family in so many ways. We'll get into that in a second. He comes in, and it is very quickly apparent that Charles has heard that the girls have money in the house. He wants their money. He wants to take Constance away. He decides that he wants to keep her for whatever reason. It's definitely implied that he doesn't have any particular romantic leaning towards her. He just wants to claim her, essentially. Charles is not a good guy. Mary Cat, on the other hand, Mary Cat is very wily. She's very dramatic, very wild, very uncontrollable. She is extraordinarily wise to what Charles is doing, and he knows it. He knows that he can't get away with anything with her, so he wants to get rid of her. He makes a lot of very interesting comments. If you pay very close attention to the things he says things like, oh, well, let's see in a month from now who's still here. Or he tells her that he knows how to get even with people. What's interesting is the author uses Uncle Julian to tell us more about Charles. We'll look at that in a second with the Gothic tropes. So those are your two dominant antagonistic forces, the village and the cousin Charles. So cousin Charles also parallels the family, and Jackson does that very well in that she sets up Uncle Julian so that he is not able to really understand who Charles is. He constantly goes in and out between understanding that Charles is their cousin and thinking that Charles is his long dead brother. So through Uncle Julian, we see a lot about what was really happening in the household, which we'll get to in a minute. But keep that in the back of your mind, that Charles is actually an antagonist who mirrors and parallels what was actually happening in the Blackwood family. So in a sense, Charles is a picture of the Blackwood family as the antagonist. And then also Charles is actually someone Jackson uses to set up the motive for Mary Catherine, for why she poisoned the entire family, which she did do, of course, which you may have guessed from the first paragraph. And it doesn't ruin it. I can read this book over and over and over. It doesn't ruin it. Mary Catherine is amazing. The theme. So obviously, I alluded to it a minute ago, Jackson is dealing very much with the village versus the individual. So the idea here is that something happens when an individual is part of a collective whole. So, and we have commented on this as a society before. We use the phrase sometimes mob mentality when we're talking about this phenomenon when you have, say, 50 individuals on their own act one way and then 50 individuals who are part of a collective. Something happens and the collective whole takes on a different life form and almost acts differently than the individuals would act on their own. So that is what she is trying to address here. She is very interested, or was, she's unfortunately no longer alive, but she was very interested in the heavy psychological and almost sociological themes that deal with the individual, and this mirrors her life story. So what does Jackson use for Gothic tropes? And I have identified perhaps 4 of them. You could probably find some more. She uses tropes in ways that are quite different from other Gothic writers. And it's interesting because I love Gothic tropes, and yet I love her book more. So there's something about the way she handles them so symbolically and so subtly that it just comes across as distinctly Gothic without ever using a heavy-handed approach. So one of the tropes Jackson definitely uses is isolation. And there are 2 different types of isolation in this book. So there is Mary Cat herself, and she just frankly hates everybody, especially due to the way they have treated the girls after this whole incident with the family. And then there is Constance. Constance is agoraphobic, as I mentioned, and she is afraid of going outside. People are trying to lure her outside, but the two girls are very isolationistic in different ways. And what's interesting is that Constance is this very malleable, very submissive character. So she's the one who Charles is almost able to overcome. She is about ready to succumb to him, allow him into the family, allow him to take over their whole home and have whatever money they have, and basically take everything away from her. It's Mary Cat who is the most volatile, who is the destructive force in the household, who is actually the best at defending them. It's interesting because what she does throughout the book, as the book moves on, Mary Catherine has a tendency towards what we call sympathetic magic. So she tends to bury things or smash mirrors or go through other ritualistic measures in order to attempt to control the world around her. So as the plot progresses, Mary Cat's actions escalate. Of course, she's meeting each challenge head on, and she is attempting more and more violently to keep out the village. And what she does appears on the surface to be very destructive. So I won't tell you exactly what she does at the end. I'll leave at least that for you. But think about it this way. So what Mary Cat does in the end is the only thing that was left to her in order to seal up their fortress from every external threat. She actually accomplished something else too. She's able to get the villagers to serve them. So she's quite effective at what she does. It looks horrific on the surface. However, she has really sealed up their castle the most effectively. And it was Constance who was the gentle, sweet soul who was unable to defend herself against the external village. So that trope of isolation and the two girls and their tendency towards isolating themselves plays very much into the theme of the individual defending oneself against the village. Secondly, you have the theme of the unreliable narrator. So I would call it, in Mary Cat's case, like psychological instability. And what's interesting is, and I said that Jackson is a master of subtext, and she really is. So you're going to have to pardon me, I'm going to read something very brief because it illustrates really well how easily it is, number one, to overlook everything Mary Cat is doing and just think she's particularly fanciful. And number two, to not understand how well she has used this trope of psychological instability. So here Mary Cat says, she's talking to her sister Constance. She says, "Today my winged horse is coming, and I am carrying you off to the moon, and on the moon we will eat rose petals." And Constance says, "Some rose petals are poisonous." And Mary Cat responds, "Not on the moon." And then she says, it seems like she's totally changing subjects, but she says, "Is it true that you can plant a leaf?" And Constance basically says, some leaves, furred leaves, you can put them in water and they grow roots, and then you plant them, and then they grow into a plant. The kind of plant they were when they started, of course, not just any plant. And Mary Cat says, "I'm sorry about that." And a minute later she says, "I like a leaf that grows into a different plant." So it would be so easy to just overlook that and think Mary Cat's just extraordinarily odd psychologically, and she is saying these things that make no sense at all. But in reality, she is saying something that makes a whole lot of sense and ties into the theme actually perfectly. So first of all, Mary Cat is a foreshadowing. At this point in the book, the reader does not know that Mary Cat is the one who poisoned the whole family. If you're reading into everything she has said, especially the first paragraph in the book, you probably guessed that she had something to do with something. So it's not the hugest shock that she is the killer. However, this is not an overtly known fact at this point in the book. So when she's talking about the rose petals and Constance says, "Well, some of them are poisonous," Mary Cat says to her, "Yeah, but I'm going to take you to the moon, and there they won't be poisonous for you," basically. So what she's hinting at is that even if she were to use something poisonous, she would defend her sister and protect her in such a way so that she would not be affected by the poisonous matter. That's exactly what she did in the poisoning. I'll leave you to read the story so you can find out how she went about this. But secondly, so there's a foreshadowing right there. Secondly, she's also telling us a lot about people. So Jackson is using Mary Cat to talk about people and to talk about the theme through this. So it's very easy to think, oh, she's talking about leaves. That's very random. The rose links into the leaf very closely. Obviously, roses have leaves. But through this illustration of the plant versus the leaf, like, can you cut off a leaf and grow a new plant? That's what Mary Cat is really asking, and Constance says, yes, some kinds you can. What Jackson is really saying there is that think of the plant as the village or the group. Think of a leaf as the individual. So you can cut off a leaf from the group, from the village, and you can replant it. But she says it will still be the same kind of plant it was before. And Mary Cat says, I'm sorry about that. She was very sad about that. She says, I wanted it to be a different plant. That's not a random comment. What she's trying to say is she wishes she could remove the individual from the village and have the individual be something different once it grows up into a new plant or a new village, but the answer is that the village will always be the village. So she's telling us something about the human collective and how that works. So that the way that all that to say that Jackson is using that trope of psychological instability to plant this constant stream of subtext that is really telling us so much more about the theme. It's like she uses every word so carefully. Really brilliant writing. So third of all, I would say she uses the Gothic trope of madness or repressed memories. Kind of hard to say which is going on, and in this case I'm talking about Uncle Julian. So Uncle Julian, of course, was there the night of the dinner. He ingested some of the poison, not enough to die. So that's why he is dying throughout the book. He's dying from the effects of the poison, but he is still well enough that he's functioning in a fairly rational way throughout the book, and yet there's something off. So his memory goes in and out. And what's interesting is Uncle Julian's entire preoccupation is with journaling about the night of the poisoning. So he is poring over everything he can possibly remember in order to try to understand what happened to the family and why. What's interesting is that he should know. He was there. He knows what happened. So Jackson tells us why Uncle Julian can't figure out what happened. And she tells us on page 93. He makes a very shocking comment. He says to their cousin Charles, he says, Mary Catherine died right after the trial. And he says that she couldn't survive, she couldn't bear the loss of her family. Now, by this point in the book, almost 100 pages into this little novella, which is about 2/3 of the way into the book, you know perfectly good and well that Mary Catherine has absolutely zero sense of bereavement about her family dying. She has no remorse whatsoever. So, this is not like The Sixth Sense where she's actually dead and she's a ghost. She's actually alive. So Uncle Julian doesn't know this. So what is going on here? Well, he has repressed in his mind what Mary Catherine did. And Jackson is using Uncle Julian as a means of putting forth Mary Catherine's motive. And she's trying to say something about the individual's actions against the village and why they're justified. So basically, Uncle Julian can pour over evidence and evidence and evidence, and he was present there as a witness, and he still cannot find Mary Catherine guilty. And the reason why is readily apparent when you watch what Uncle Julian is saying throughout the book. So when you look at their cousin Charles, and this will tie in, so stay with me. So when you look at their cousin Charles, Uncle Julian continually mistakes Charles for his dead brother John, which I mentioned earlier. And because of that, Uncle Julian tells us a whole lot about what the Blackwood family was like. And for example, they were nice to them. They were nice to Uncle Julian and his wife as long as he ate very sparingly. And they were very materialistic and very greedy and dishonest. And the more you watch what Uncle Julian is saying, the more you understand that the Blackwood family was terrible. They were extremely cruel, vicious people. And so there's something of a sympathy within Uncle Julian for what Mary Catherine has done, and yet he can't allow himself to acquit her, and yet he also can't allow himself to find her guilty. He has convinced himself that Mary Catherine died in order to get around finding her guilty, basically. So it's very, very interesting. And through him, you really see what Jackson is trying to say to the readers. So she's placing the readers in Uncle Julian's perspective and saying that we should also look at Mary Catherine and see the individual pitted against this very cruel and very vicious village. And even if we know that Mary Catherine is guilty, we still should not be able to find her guilty in the sense that we hold her accountable for her crimes. So in a sense, we find her actions justified, which is exactly what's happening within Uncle Julian's mind. Fourth and lastly, Jackson uses the trope of what Mary Cat alludes to as, and what I'm calling here, ghosts and demons. So Mary Cat, just like Uncle Julian, Mary Cat, although she's not confusing cousin Charles for her father, she still says he does look exactly like her father, or very much so, and he personality-wise is very much like him, which is not a compliment. So she calls cousin Charles a ghost and a demon. And so through them, you see a picture of the lesser village, which is what I was alluding to earlier when I said the first antagonist is really the village. So there's the greater village, meaning the actual community, the town in which they're living, which is acting against them. And then there was the lesser village. And the lesser village is symbolized by Charles, and the lesser village was the Blackwood family. So through the ghost or demon, as Mary Cat calls him, Jackson is portraying cousin Charles as something of a lesser village acting against the individual, and he does in fact act against the two women throughout the book. So essentially, if you look at the story, you see a very Gothic theme. You see a very irrational one of understanding how individuals in collective act against the individual alone, or to say it a different way, like how a group so often can act against someone who doesn't belong to the group, and the people within that group act in ways that they never would, they wouldn't even dream of acting that way if they were on their own. So that is a very irrational, very psychological theme. And you've got all of these tropes, the isolation, the ghosts, the psychological instability, the repressed memories. All of them are really supporting that theme that the individual must act violently against the village in order to survive. So I would call this definitely Gothic. Shirley Jackson writes very squarely in the Gothic genre, and yet she does it in such a unique way. I would highly recommend checking her out. And this is a good one to start with because it's shorter if you're not used to her writing. So that's all for today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, ring that bell, and don't forget to subscribe below. That way you'll be notified every time I release a new video. I post videos on Friday, so until next time, stay undead, my friend.